My parents threw me out on my 27th birthday. I slept in a cheap motel. Years later, I bought my own house. They walked in and said, "It's a family asset." My name is Clare Morgan, and the day my life truly started was when my parents discarded me like trash on my own birthday. Can you imagine the gut-wrenching betrayal of being thrown out of your own home by your parents on your 27th birthday? Well, that was just the appetizer. Years later, after I had scraped and fought for everything I had, they walked into the house I owned and calmly declared, "This is a family asset." What the hell did I do next? You're about to find out. It was my 27th birthday, a day that's supposed to make you feel well-wanted, celebrated. Instead, I remember finishing a grueling shift at the grocery store. My feet throbbed, and the scent of spilled coffee clung to me, but I was still clinging to a sliver of hope. On my break, I'd bought myself a cheap cupcake from the bakery aisle. Just a small, defiant act, figuring if no one else remembered, I would. Driving home, I pictured some modest surprise, maybe a pizza box on the counter, or a store-bought cake with my name slightly misspelled. But as I turned onto our street, a cold dread washed over me. No balloons, no extra cars, no festive decorations, just my entire life meticulously piled on the front lawn. My luggage, boxes of clothes, a plastic bucket brimming with old textbooks, even my beat-up monitor covered with a blanket. For a split second, my mind went to a burst pipe, a fire, some kind of emergency. I parked crookedly, leaving the lonely cupcake on the passenger seat, and walked towards the house. My mother was on the porch, arms tightly crossed, her expression a mask of chilling resolve. My father hovered behind her, staring intently at the ground, as if the concrete held all the answers. And my youngest sister, Ava Morgan, sat on the steps, oblivious, scrolling on her phone. They didn't wish me a happy birthday. Not a single word. My mother's voice cut through the evening air, sharp and unyielding. "You're 27, Clare Morgan. This has lasted long enough. We need the room. You have to leave." I just stared at her. "Today? You're doing this today? On my birthday?" She rolled her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it stung. "Don't be so dramatic. We raised you. We've done our part. You have a job. You'll figure it out." My father finally glanced up, his voice barely a whisper. "This is for your own good. You'll grow if you're pushed." Then Ava chimed in, a smirk playing on her lips. "Everyone I know moved out ages ago. You should be thanking Mom." 1,000 retorts choked in my throat. I wanted to scream that I was the one paying most of the electricity bills, that the Wi-Fi she was using for her online classes stayed on because of my wages. But I knew how it would go. My mother, dissolving into tears, calling me ungrateful. My father, retreating into his usual silence. Ava, probably filming the whole dramatic meltdown for her friends. I'd still end up outside, but with a raw throat and an even heavier heart. So, I didn't give them the show they wanted. I just asked, my voice surprisingly steady, "Where should I go?" My mother shrugged. "You're an adult. Stay with a friend. Find something cheap. Just don't expect to come back. We need to transform your space into something useful." Useful. As if I'd never even existed. My parents kicked me out on my birthday, and I didn't say anything. I just started picking up my boxes, one by one, carrying them to my beat-up car. There was no begging, no bargaining, just the grating scratch of cardboard on concrete. With every box, the reality solidified. No major confrontation, no dramatic parting. Just quiet, crushing finality. I took one last look at that front door, the place I'd called home my entire life, and knew, with absolute certainty, it wasn't anymore. Maybe it never had been. I drove until the familiar houses faded into highway signs. Eventually, I pulled into a shoddy rural motel. Half its neon sign burned out. The room reeked of old smoke and harsh bleach, but I had the key clutched in my hand, and no one could order me to leave. I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable bed, ate that cold, lonely cupcake, and checked my bank account. The number was pathetic, terrifying. For a desperate second, I considered calling my mother, begging for a few days of grace. Then I remembered her confident smirk, my belongings strewn across the lawn. They hadn't hesitated, so neither would I, lying on that scratchy blanket, staring at the discolored ceiling. I made myself a promise. I would never again ask to return to a place that treated me like garbage. If they really wanted me gone, I'd figure out a way to make them regret pushing me out the door one day. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck, a pounding headache, and absolutely no safety net. I checked my phone, half expecting a missed call from my parents. An apology, or at least a "where are you?" Maybe we overreacted. There was nothing but a calendar notification that read, "Happy birthday, Clare Morgan," like a cruel joke from an app that didn't know any better. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I got up, splashed cold water on my face, put on my uniform, and drove to work as if my entire world hadn't just shattered into a million pieces. I worked that grocery store shift pretending everything was normal, smiling at customers, scanning items, making small talk about deals and recipes, all while my brain screamed, "You have nowhere to sleep tonight." During my break, I frantically searched for rooms for rent on my phone, sifting by cheapest first, praying for anything that didn't look like a horror movie set. Seattle was about 90 minutes away, and the rents made my stomach churn. But staying at that motel wasn't an option. By the end of the day, I'd secured a viewing for a tiny studio in the city, the kind with peeling paint, a view of a brick wall, and a landlord who didn't ask too many questions as long as you had the deposit. I signed the papers with the shaky assurance of someone who wasn't sure how they'd afford next month. The first few weeks were hell. I kept my grocery store job, but the commute was brutal and the pay barely covered rent. So I took on a second job, working late-night shifts at a burger restaurant a few blocks from my studio. My days became an endless cycle. Wake up before sunrise, grocery store for 9 hours, quick snack in the car, clock in at the burger joint, smell like fries and grease until 1 a.m., stumble home, shower, pass out, repeat. There was no time to think about my parents, which, in a twisted way, was exactly the point. Then, one night at the grocery store, a woman came through my line who I recognized immediately. Rachel Bennett. She'd been a regular for months, always with a laptop bag and a Bluetooth headset, chatting about deadlines and investors on her phone. I wasn't sure what she did, but it always sounded incredibly important. That night, she was distracted, scrolling through emails as I rang up her items. When her reusable bag ripped, I instinctively helped her repack everything, double bagging the heavy stuff, even cracking a silly joke about duct tape holding adult life together. She genuinely chuckled and glanced at my name tag. "You're the girl who always fixes the self-checkouts, right?" she asked. I shrugged, a little ashamed. I just punch a couple buttons to reset them when they freeze. But she made it sound like I was performing surgery. She asked how long I'd been working there. And before I could stop myself, the entire condensed, messy narrative came spilling out. My parents kicked me out. I'm figuring things out. 2 jobs, tiny apartment, no plans beyond survival. Instead of the usual pity grimace, she just looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You know, my startup is always looking for people who can problem solve and actually show up. Do you ever think about technology?" I laughed. It sounded absurd. I hadn't even graduated college. Tech? She told me about coding boot camps, how many people changed careers without a degree, and how the internet was packed with free resources. Then she did something surprising. She wrote her email address on the back of my receipt. "If you're serious about changing your life, send me an email. I can't guarantee you anything, but I can point you in the right direction." That night, after my burger shift, I sat at the tiny table in my studio, laptop open, looking up everything she'd mentioned. Free courses, beginner-friendly tutorials, coding boot camps in Seattle. The words on the screen might as well have been in another language, but one thought stuck with me. I'd already lost everything once. What was the worst case scenario if I tried and failed again? Over the next few months, I carved out time I didn't have. I watched JavaScript lessons during my lunch breaks. I printed cheat sheets and taped them above my thrift store desk. I joined free online groups where people asked and answered questions I didn't understand yet. But very slowly, things began to click. One late night, after finally finishing a practice assignment, I gathered the courage to email Rachel. I told her I was serious, attaching screenshots of my sloppy, small websites that I'd built by copying tutorials line by line and then trying to modify them. She responded not with a job offer, but with something better, a link to a part-time coding boot camp she recommended, along with a message that said, "If you get into this and commit, I'll talk to my team about an internship." I applied, figuring it was a long shot. Somehow I got in. My schedule became utterly ridiculous. Grocery store in the mornings, fewer burger shifts so I could study, and boot camp classes in the evenings and on weekends. I survived on ramen, black coffee, and the occasional free meal when the burger joint messed up an order. My friends stopped inviting me out because the answer was always, I have to work or study. There were so many nights I felt stupid and behind, staring at error messages until my eyes burned. Days I wanted to quit, especially when my body seemed to give up before my brain. But every time I thought about giving up, I pictured that pile of my belongings on my parents' lawn. I heard my mother's voice again. "You'll thank us one day." I decided that if I ever thanked them, it would be for underestimating me. About 18 months later, I completed the boot camp. I wasn't a coding genius, but I could make things work. Rachel arranged an interview with her company, and for the first time in my life, I sat in a conference room wearing actual clothes, not a polo with a name tag. I talked about problem-solving customer frustrations at the grocery store, about late-night teamwork at the burger joint, about the sheer grit it took to juggle it all while learning something completely new. They hired me as an associate front-end developer. The salary was more than my previous jobs combined, and there was a clear path for advancement. When the offer email landed in my inbox, I stood in the middle of my cramped studio and just stared at it. The girl who'd packed her life into a motel room on her birthday was now being hired to work for a software company in Seattle. I didn't cry. I didn't call my parents. I just whispered to myself, "You cast me out to make way for Ava and her future. You really wanted me gone. All you actually did was give me the space to create my own." When I first started at the company, I felt like an imposter in my own life. The office was downtown Seattle, all glass windows and cold brew on tap, the kind of place I used to think only existed in movies. For the first few months, I kept waiting for someone to tap my shoulder and tell me they'd made a mistake, that I was supposed to be back at the grocery store asking customers if they preferred paper or plastic. Instead, I kept showing up. I asked stupid questions. I stayed late to fix bugs. I watched how senior developers approached problems and adopted their habits. I took notes on everything. Rachel never treated me like a charity case. She gave me real tasks, real feedback, sometimes harsh enough to sting, but always followed by, "You can do better than this, and I know it." Slowly, my code broke less, and my confidence broke more in the right places. Almost 2 years passed. I moved from junior to mid-level. I got my first raise, then another. For the first time, my bank account wasn't an emergency. I stayed in that tiny studio longer than necessary, partly because I was afraid the good run would end, and partly because I was used to cramming myself into small spaces. But one day, my lease renewal arrived with a rent increase that made my eyes widen. I sat at my small table, a spreadsheet open, tracking my income and expenses, and something crazy started to form at the edge of my consciousness. What if, instead of paying more for the shoebox, I invested that money into something I actually owned? The thought of owning anything bigger than a thrift store couch was absurd. Yet I couldn't shake it. I started listening to personal finance podcasts on my commutes. I learned what a credit score was and what a down payment looked like in numbers, not just vague adult language. I dug through my online accounts and noticed something ridiculous. Between my steady paycheck, a few freelance online gigs on the side, and the fact that I'd been too terrified to spend for years, I had saved money. Not rich people money, but enough to spark a serious conversation. I talked to a loan officer who explained financing options, pre-approval, and interest rates. It felt like he was speaking another language. But I kept asking questions until the numbers made sense. "You're in a far better situation than most people your age," he told me. I remembered my parents telling me I was a burden, that I would never grow unless they pushed me out. I didn't say it aloud, but part of me wanted to frame that email and post it on their old front door. I spent weekends driving through different neighborhoods. Some were totally out of my league, with immaculate, artificial families in the brochures. Some were run down and grim, hitting too close to where I'd started. Then I walked into a small, 4-story townhouse in Ballard. It wasn't glamorous enough for a magazine cover, but it was solid. Clean lines, a small lawn, and a modest balcony off the master bedroom. The sunlight filtered through the living room windows just perfectly, catching dust motes in the air like glitter. The kitchen was open, with enough counter space to make actual food, not just microwave whatever was on offer. Upstairs, there was a bonus room that could be an office, a guest room, or maybe a place where I could create something entirely new. I stood there, listening to the silence, and for the first time since leaving my parents' house, I felt what home might be like when it didn't belong to someone who could toss me out at any moment. I submitted an offer. The negotiation felt like a game I hadn't prepared for, but my agent guided me through it. When I got the call that my offer had been accepted, I was at my desk at work, staring at a bug report. I had to go into the stairwell to collect my breath. The girl who once collected change to pay for a motel bed was about to sign papers, putting her name on a property deed. On the final day, I sat in a boring office, signing stack after stack of paperwork. Every time the pen touched the page, I remembered a new version of myself. The child sneaking grocery store sushi into her bedroom, the cashier with aching feet, the young woman covering her belongings on the grass as her family watched. Each signature felt like a line that separated me from the past. When it was over, the woman across from me slid the final document away and said, "Congratulations, homeowner." Walking into the townhouse with my own keys felt surreal. There was no furniture yet, just echoing rooms and bare walls that smelled of new paint and possibilities. That night, I laid on the living room floor with a single pillow and a blanket, looking up at the ceiling, listening to the buzz of the city outside and the profound silence within. Nobody could walk in and tell me I was taking up too much room. Nobody could decide that my room was needed by someone else. This place had my name on it. Over the next few months, I built a life within those walls. I bought a couch that didn't come from the curb. I set up a proper workstation with a real monitor in the spare room and named it my office. I invited a few work friends over, cooked for them, laughed too loudly, and no one complained about the noise. On clear nights, I'd stand on the little balcony with a mug of tea, looking out over the neighborhood, reflecting on the journey from that rural motel to here. I even started publishing parts of my experience online, not to vent about my parents, but to talk about hitting rock bottom and fighting my way back. People started responding. Strangers messaged me, saying they felt seen, that their families had driven them out in various, equally painful ways. For the first time, my sorrow seemed useful to someone other than myself. I thought the story would end there. I got kicked out on my birthday, battled my way up, and bought a house. It was a neat little arc. But life isn't a movie, and apparently my folks didn't like being left out of the finale. One tranquil Sunday afternoon, I was unloading groceries, humming to myself when my doorbell rang. I didn't think much of it, maybe a package or a neighbor. I wiped my hands on a towel, headed to the front door, and checked the camera screen out of habit. When I saw who was standing on my porch, my stomach dropped to my feet. My mother, my father, and my sister, all three of them, standing at the entrance to the house I had built without them. For a moment, I thought the camera was malfunctioning. No, it was them. My mother in front, a little grayer, a little more makeup. My father slumped behind her. Ava Morgan stood off to the side, absorbed in her phone. I could have pretended I wasn't home, but I'd had enough of hiding in places I paid for. I opened the door. My mother scrutinized me for a moment before sweeping past me into the house. Clare Morgan, you look different, she commented, her gaze already scanning my furnishings. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice tight. My father tried a softer tone. Can we come in for a minute? It's important. Against my better judgment, I stepped back. They strode in as if they owned the air. My mother ran her fingertips along the couch. This is nice. Much nicer than that little place you used to have. Ava, despite herself, looked impressed. Damn, Nat, you really got yourself a whole house. I stayed rooted near the kitchen island. Why are you here? I asked again, firmer this time. My father sighed. Things have been difficult. I lost my job. Our mortgage is killing us. We could lose our house. My mother cut in. The bank doesn't care how long we've been there. They just want money. We heard you bought a property. This changes everything. I felt a fleeting flash of pity, but it vanished quickly. I'm sorry things are hard, I said, but how does that relate to my house? My mother gave me a look that suggested I was being incredibly dense. This is more than just your house, she explained. This is a family asset. The phrase landed like a stone. Excuse me. I replied. She gestured around the walls. We raised you. Roof, food, and clothing. We encouraged you to be independent. If we hadn't forced you out, you'd still be stuck in that dead-end grocery store. Our fierce love shaped who you are. So obviously, what you have today should benefit the entire family. My father nodded. We're not asking for much. We just need to stay here for a while. Your mother and I can have one room, and Ava another. You still have that office, right? You don't need a whole room just for a desk. Maybe we'll even put our names on the papers, so the bank sees it as shared. It benefits everyone. I nearly laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You kicked me out because you said there was no room, I reminded them. You needed my bedroom for Ava's online classes. Now my house is the answer to all your problems. My mother waved her hand dismissively. We did it for you, she snapped. If we hadn't pushed you, you wouldn't have left. You should be grateful. Our investment is paying off. A family asset. Ava chimed in. Mom's right. You moved up. Everyone I know moved out years ago. You have spare rooms. Why are you acting so selfishly? There it was. The ancient word. I'm not being selfish by living in the house for which I worked and paid, I said, my voice rising. You didn't co-sign anything. You are not on the deed. This is mine. My mother's eyes became stern. You wouldn't have this job without us. We made sacrifices. We struggled. We pushed you. You owe us. One signature, and your parents aren't on the street. Would you rather see us homeless while you sit here alone? Guilt used to work on me. Now it only made me exhausted. You made your decision, I said. I made mine. I'm not jeopardizing my house or my future so you can pretend this is a communal project. Ava scoffed. Money really changed you. I shook my head. Being treated as trash on my birthday changed me. Money only means you can't do it again. My mother's voice dropped, laced with a new kind of threat. If you don't help us, we will pursue legal action. We're your parents. We have rights. Any judge will see this as a family asset that you are hoarding. For a brief, terrifying moment, the old fear returned. Then I remembered whose name was on every single important paper. Contact any lawyer you choose, I said, my voice steady now. You aren't moving in. You are not allowed to touch my property, and you must leave immediately. My father tried one final, desperate plea. Claire, please. We're your family. You did this, I responded. I swung the door wide. Cold light poured in. Last time you told me to go. This time, I'm the one asking you to leave." My mother let out a harsh, disbelieving chuckle and moved past me. My father followed, looking at the floor. Ava walked by and whispered, "You are going to regret this." I shut the door and slowly, deliberately turned the lock. My hands shook, but beneath the adrenaline, there was a constant, profound calm. They had walked into my house, confident that the words "family asset" would be enough to terrify me into giving up everything I had achieved. They still assumed I was the girl whose life was in boxes on their yard. They had no idea that this time I wasn't the one to be terrified. When the door clicked shut behind them, I stood there leaning against it, breathing hard. Their threats echoed in my mind like a terrible commercial. Legal action, family assets, parental rights. The old me would have spiraled, Googling property laws at 2:30 a.m., imagining the worst-case scenarios. But the version of myself that had signed a mortgage and debugged code at 2 a.m. knew better than to let panic be the sole strategy. So I did what I usually do when I feel out of my element. I called someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. In this case, that someone was Daniel Cruz, a guy I'd met years ago through a friend of a friend. He'd gone from bartending to law school, just as I was transitioning from grocery clerk to developer. We'd reconnected in Seattle when I discovered he was practicing civil law, specializing in tenant and financial issues. We weren't best friends, but we trusted each other enough to swap war stories about shady landlords and employers. I texted him, "Hey, I think my folks are about to do something insane with my house. Got time to talk?" He called within 40 minutes. I told him everything, from being kicked out on my birthday to the surreal visit in my living room, my mother dropping the words "family asset" like a bomb. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Okay," he finally said. "First and foremost, breathe. They are not on your deed, correct?" "Correct," I stated. "I bought this house years after they evicted me. They didn't help with anything. It's in my name solely." "Then, technically, they have no ownership claim just because they share DNA," he explained. "They can argue all day about what's fair or familial, but in court, paper wins over guilt trips. However, the fact that they've threatened legal action and are attempting to bully you into including them on the deed is pretty suspicious. And the way they booted you out previously isn't a good look for them either." I felt a little knot of stress relax in my chest. So, they can't actually force me to give them anything? No judge is going to instantly transform your private property into a shared family asset just because your mother believes she deserves a portion, he added. "But there's something else we should look into. You mentioned that while you lived there, you helped them with paperwork and bills, right?" "Yes," I replied slowly. I was the only one who could navigate online forms without shrieking at the computer. Why? Because the people who feel entitled to your house years later are often the same people who felt entitled to your knowledge at the time, he said. "Before we do anything else, I want you to pull your full credit report. Not the cute free app version, the real one. We need to make sure they haven't already been using you to support themselves financially." The notion made my stomach plummet. I remembered sitting at their kitchen table years ago, filling out lines on credit card applications as my mother hustled me, saying, "Just sign here. It's for the family." I was too exhausted and trusting to ask questions. I now saw those memories in a different, chilling light. That night, I sat at my desk in the home office they wanted to claim, logged into all 3 major credit bureaus and requested my reports. When they finally loaded, I felt as if I was peering into someone else's life. There were accounts I recognized, my student loan for the 2 semesters of college I completed before dropping out, my own credit card, my car's auto loan. And then there were accounts I'd never seen before. Store cards I'd never used. A line of credit opened the year I was kicked out, a few small personal loans in my name tied to an address I used to share with my parents. My chest went cold. I called Daniel back and explained what I was seeing. "That," he said gently, "is identity theft, at best illegal usage, and at worst blatant fraud. And if your parents open them in your name without your knowledge or consent, we're going to need to do more than send a stern email. Over the following weeks, my life became a strange blend of routine and surreal. By day, I went to work, wrote code, attended meetings about product roadmaps, and joked with coworkers in the kitchen. By night, I sat at my dining table with Daniel on speakerphone, gathering documents, underlining dates, cross-referencing addresses, piecing together the paper trail of how my parents had quietly transformed my name into a financial safety net while calling me a burden to my face. Daniel Cruz helped me file official challenges with credit bureaus over accounts I did not establish. We contacted banks and lenders, wrote notarized letters, and provided affidavits stating I had been kicked out and had no knowledge of the obligations. Some institutions were cooperative. Others treated me as if I were the one running a fraud. Every time a customer service representative questioned my narrative, I considered calling my parents and yelling at them. Instead, I reminded myself that I wouldn't be cleaning up their mess for them. I was cleaning up my name for myself. At the same time, Daniel pursued a restraining order based on my parents' threats and their history of kicking me out. We provided screenshots of texts my mother sent following their visit. Messages like, "You will regret choosing a house over your family, and we will make sure everyone knows how heartless you are." They had mistaken them for guilt trips. The court saw them as harassment. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Daniel asked me one night, "Once we file, it becomes official. This is no longer just a family disagreement." I remembered the girl who had stood on the grass, her life in boxes, while her own mother told her to work it out. I pictured them marching into my home as if they were entitled to it, asking me to sign over control without blinking. "Yeah," I answered. "I'm sure." They didn't hesitate when they kicked me out. I'm done being hesitant when it comes to defending myself. The court first issued an interim injunction, preventing my parents from visiting my home or job while the full hearing was arranged. When the papers were served, my phone exploded. My mother called and left voicemails, screaming about betrayal and disgrace. My father sent lengthy messages outlining how this could all be handled quietly. Ava sent a single text. "You actually brought the law into this tragic situation." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I sent everything to Daniel. He added it to the file. Then, quietly, another piece moved across the board. Some of the challenged accounts prompted internal investigations by the lenders. One of them spotted suspicious patterns and sent the material to a government agency. Another related to a bogus home improvement loan carried out just before my parents' financial collapse. Turn the information over to the IRS because the income records didn't match. "This is where it could get bigger than you," Daniel warned me. "If they've been evading taxes or using your name to secure further credit, the IRS isn't going to just shrug and walk away." Part of me felt queasy about it. These were still my parents, no matter how twisted up they were. The prospect of them facing an inquiry made my stomach turn. But another part of me, the one that had stood in a rural motel, counting crumpled cash while their identities remained clean, thought it sounded a lot like justice. Several months passed. There were forms, hearings, and more phone calls than I can count. Then, the restraining order was made permanent. They argued in court that I was overreacting, that kids nowadays label anything abuse, and that they had only ever tried to teach me responsibility. But when tested under oath and with documents, their tale fell apart. They couldn't explain why they had opened loans based on my social security number. They couldn't explain the text messages that sounded like threats. They couldn't spin the idea of throwing their kid out on her birthday into a heroic sacrifice. The judge issued the injunction, noting a history of emotional manipulation and financial abuse. My parents exited the courtroom looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. That was only round one. Round two began after the IRS completed whatever silent work they were doing in the background. I was brought in as a witness, not a suspect, to explain what I knew and didn't know about the loans and accounts. I answered honestly. I had signed paperwork I didn't understand under duress. I had trusted that they wouldn't use me. I had been kicked out of the house and the finances the moment I ceased being convenient. When I walked out of the federal building, I felt as if I had opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Letters eventually began to arrive at my parents' address, and then at their new rental location. Notices, requests, and inquiries for unpaid taxes, undeclared income, and fraudulent applications. Their former house, the one they had kicked me out of to make room for my sister, was ultimately foreclosed on and sold to satisfy a portion of their debt. The irony wasn't lost on me. The home that had served as their stronghold, their symbol of supremacy, was now gone as a result of their own decisions. Without that house, without solid credit, and without the steady career my father had lost, their alternatives narrowed rapidly. They moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, then into something even smaller when the bills kept arriving. My mother transitioned from bragging on Facebook about her beautiful family to posting vague rants about ungrateful children and crooked institutions, hinted at but never detailed enough to admit what truly transpired. My father picked up odd jobs, doing whatever he could, his pride eaten whole. Ava, who once mocked me for working at a grocery store, ended up folding clothes for a retail chain during the day and running delivery apps at night, screaming about how unfair the world was. I knew all this not because I tracked them, but because others emailed me screenshots with the question, "Is this about you?" I never responded publicly. Instead, I recounted my side of the story in a way that didn't identify them, but also didn't conceal what happened. I talked about parents who use guilt as leverage, and families that believe they're entitled to their adult children's success while never accepting responsibility for the pain they've inflicted. I talked about getting kicked out on my birthday, staying in a hotel, and learning to distinguish love from loyalty to people who repeatedly mistreated me. The more I shared, the more I learned from others who had experienced variations on the same script. It turns out I wasn't special, and that, surprisingly, was incredibly soothing. One night, months after everything had been officially resolved, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open when another email from a lender arrived. "We have concluded our investigation," it stated. "We have determined that you are not liable for the debts in question. These accounts will be erased from your credit record." I stared at the words for a long time. My name, which they had signed on paperwork as if it was theirs to use, was now clear. My home was safe. My future was mine. I remembered my mother standing in this very kitchen, stating that it was a family asset. In a way, she was right, but not in the way she intended. Their journey finished with courtrooms and collection notices, in small apartments and diminished lives. Mine was only just getting started. For the first time, the scales seemed balanced. They had driven me out, taken advantage of me, and tried to grab all I had built. Ultimately, all they did was provide me with the space and the fierce determination to create a life beyond their reach. In the silence that followed the attorneys, the letters, and the courtrooms, I began to notice something disturbing. Winning doesn't make up for what you lost. There was no moment when my parents suddenly understood. No heartfelt apology, no clean reconciliation. They continued telling everyone who would listen that I had wrecked their lives by putting a house above my own blood. I used to agonize over that charge, wondering if there was any version of the narrative in which I could have helped them without harming myself. But every time I walked through my own door, dropped my keys in the bowl by the threshold, and felt the solid weight of my own security, I knew the answer. They'd spent years convincing me that love meant sacrificing yourself for their comfort. Cutting them off was the first real lesson I taught myself. My life began to fill with different kinds of people. Coworkers who checked on me when I looked exhausted. Neighbors who offered cookies as I shoveled their side of the sidewalk. Friends who crashed on my couch, not because they'd been kicked out, but because we'd been laughing too late to drive home. On Wednesday nights, I hosted a small group at my dining table, a mismatched circle of folks, each with their own story of a family that hurt more than it helped. We didn't sit around criticizing our parents. We compared notes on boundaries. We discussed therapy, savings accounts, and the exact moment each of us realized we could say no without presenting a lengthy list of reasons. My home became precisely what my parents had unknowingly predicted. It was not a family asset, but a secure location where individuals might land, relax, and then relaunch on their own terms. Sometimes late at night, I would stand in the doorway of the extra room they had wanted for themselves and just stare at it. The perfectly made bed, the bookshelf, the desk where I occasionally wrote. I could almost see two timelines stacked on top of one another. In one, my parents were slamming doors and shouting about everything I had done wrong, turning my house into just another place I had to tiptoe around. In the one I chose, that room remained available for the version of myself who needed it the most, and for anyone else seeking confirmation that starting anew was possible. I won't pretend it's easy to prioritize yourself over your family. It is one of the hardest things I have ever done. There are still holidays when scrolling through photos of large, happy families seated at long tables stings me. But I did learn something invaluable. Blood is not an excuse to harm you repeatedly. Being related does not automatically grant someone access to your time, your money, or your home. Love without respect is simply control wrapped up in nicer language. My parents used to tell me that one day I'd thank them for kicking me out. I don't thank them for their cruelty or their lies, but I will concede this. The day they kicked me out on my birthday marked the end of their story and the beginning of mine. If you're listening to this and seeing aspects of your life in mine, I want you to know you're not crazy. You are not ungrateful, and you are absolutely not alone. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to build a life in which the people who have wronged you are not permitted to participate. They tried to tell me that this house was a family asset. They were right about one thing. It is about family. So, tell me, what would you have done in my shoes? Or if you faced something similar, how did you find your own way forward? I really want to hear your stories in the comments below.